make it. And I want to let you know that Kathleen Wynne, Premier Wynne, is planning to attend at around 3:45. Everybody's busy, and so we're delighted that they're managing to eke out time for us for this event. And so look out for our Premier Wynne, and certainly stick around till the end and beyond, because she's hoping to stay and mingle with us. So think about all the things you want to tell her when you get the opportunity. And my dear, dear friend, Dr. Karen Mock has just arrived, and I wanted to give her a shout out because she's just been called to the Order of Canada. So, for the wonderful work that she does. She's been a longtime friend of Noor. Actually, I want to say to all the friends of Noor from different communities who are here today, I am so touched that you came out. You're showing your friendship, as you have all along, but particularly today, that you made the effort to come out on this weather with all the other conflicting commitments you have to share with us our commemoration. So thank you. You all know who you are. I'm looking at you. All of you, thank you so much. And so now I'm going to hand over to Khadija. Oh, I'm sorry. How could I ever forget? So yes, MP Yasmin Ratansi, who's going to make a very quick presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So good afternoon, Salaam Alaikum, Shalom, and Namaskar. This is World Interfaith Harmony Week, and I was proud as one of the founding members, including Khadija and John Vorpassel, to present a statement in the House on this. And we're hoping that there would be a motion to recognize February 1st to 7th as World Interfaith Harmony Week. I've been pushing in Parliament, so hopefully that happens. But I'm here today because the Quebec shooting was an act of, I think, terrorism. And we can call it what it is. We cannot mince words when things happen to Muslims. When a Muslim does something, then guess what? It is terrorism act. But when somebody else does it, he or she is deranged. So I'd like to commend Noor Cultural Center for opening this space for whenever they have their Friday prayers. And if you haven't attended the Friday prayers, do attend, because they have such an open dialogue with all faith groups. And I see that there are people from the synagogue that has been partnering with Noor Cultural Center. The Noor Cultural Center has done a lot. Under the leadership of Samira Kanji. Her two daughters may take credit for whatever they want to take credit for, but Samira is the driving force. So as a member of Parliament for the riding of Don Valley East, because this is federally, and on the occasion of the remembrance and reflections of 1 year after the Quebec City Mosque shooting event, I offer my thanks to the Noor Cultural Center for being in the forefront of issues on social justice. And I'd appreciate if you would come and get this certificate. Thank you. Was it short enough? She has been a friend for a long time. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you, Yasmin. Even if we disagree about the distribution of credit, we can duke that out later, maybe. A few housekeeping notes. So washrooms are downstairs to the left of the wudu areas, which is ablution areas for non-Muslims. That's the ritual cleansing before the prayers. So wudu and washroom facilities are downstairs, and there's also the prayer facility there as well. So please make use. We have refreshments at the back, so please help yourself to that. And I'll just ask that everyone silence any cell phones or noise-making devices. And then we will get right to it. So I know everyone everyone knows why they're here. It's to commemorate 1 year since the fatal shooting at Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City, which happened on January 29th, 2017. And I just want to remind everyone of the names of the brothers that we lost on that day. They're also projected back there. Abdel Karim Hussein, Mamadou Tanu Bari, Ibrahima Bari, Azadine Sufyan, Khalid Balkasimi, Abu Bakr Tabti. So the 6 killed, and there were also 19 injured. And I think we can never repeat these names enough, because even as we move in, and this program includes a discussion of the broader context of Islamophobia in Canada, we never want to lose the individuals who are most intimately affected we don't want to lose sight of the individuals who are most intimately affected by the Islamophobic context, even while we make sure that we don't individualize the politics of it. So I did want to repeat their names. And also to mention, and Brother Tariq, who I'll introduce in a second, will be mentioning more about this, but we're also doing a collection, and you'll see the box outside, for Brother Ayman Derbali. He was left paralyzed in the shooting when he took several bullets, saving others. And he is now separated from his family. He's living in a rehab facility until he can afford a safe and accessible home. So he's currently unable to be united with his family. And so DawaNet has done a wonderful fundraiser. I think the goal has been around 400,000, and they're quite close. So inshallah, if you're able, please contribute to this fundraiser. And so now I want to introduce Brother Tariq Syed from DawaNet. He'll be leading the Remembrance portion of this event. So as you would have noticed in the program, this event includes a remembrance as well as a reflection on the context of Islamophobia. So Brother Tariq is leading the Remembrance, and he's an executive member and the creative director of DawaNet and Muslim Fest. For those who don't know, DawaNet is a Canadian Muslim community empowerment, engagement, and education organization based out of Mississauga. And one of their many projects, and their very dynamic organization, has been to create a documentary about the Quebec mosque shooting called Your Last Walk in the Mosque. And I'll allow Brother Tariq to come up here now and introduce a little bit more of that documentary, and then we'll also be showing an excerpt. So please, Brother Tariq.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us tonight. It was March 3rd week. Myself and DawaNet team, we were in preparation of making our second trip to Quebec to distribute the funds that we raised earlier that month right after the attack, about $400,000. We did an online campaign on GoFundMe, and the money came in from all over Canada. Yeah, so we did the GoFundMe campaign, and within a few weeks, we got $400,000 that came in from all over Canada, and people from all faith and background, they supported us to help the families. So I was preparing for my trip to Quebec, and I was at work, and one of my colleagues, I was telling my colleague that, I went to the funerals in January and also met with the families. Now I'm making my second trip where we'll be distributing the funds. And he was, and he asked me something very strange that really shook me. He told me, "Oh yeah, that was very terrible, man. Yeah, I remember that. How many people died? Was it 5 people or 6 people?" And I was like, "We are here just like literally few weeks after the most horrific attack that ever happened in Canadian at a religious place, and this person doesn't even know how many people died. Forget about the names, forget about the stories, forget about like what the background is from." And then I was making my trip to Quebec with DawaNet team, and I was thinking to myself, what can I do? We need to do something about this, so that we can preserve the story, so that as many people can know about this terrible tragedy that happened in Quebec. And then obviously we went to Quebec, and this was the first time actually I was inside their homes. I was meeting the families, I was meeting the orphans. We were talking to the widows while the 2 years were like playing around in the living room. And I was like, these are these are the people that everyone needs to know about. That's when the idea of documentary came in, and I spoke with the Dawane team, with the RAF, Taha, and everyone else there, and immediately they said, like, this is a very good idea, let's do it. And that's how the documentary came in place. It was very challenging. We went back in May to do the shooting and stuff, and it was one of the most difficult project or tasks that I took on myself. Sitting with them in their rooms, most of the time in the mosque where the attack actually happened, and asking them to basically relive what went through that particular night. It was very, very challenging, very emotionally draining, and something I never expected, something I don't want to ever feel again. I'm really glad. Thank you, Sister Samira, the sisters Khatija and Sister Aziza for hosting the documentary and inviting me here to show some extracts of the documentary. The full documentary will be sent to various film festivals across Canada. I have requests from New York and Paris to bring this documentary there, so I'm still in talks with them. But once we run out these options of film festivals and screening at various places, this will be available for free of cost online for everyone to watch. So when it's available, I would request every one of you to watch it and also share it with as many people as possible, just to get a glimpse into the lives of these people. The purpose of making the documentary was to preserve the history of these brothers, the 6 brothers that died that day. Also to give opportunity to survivors to speak from their perspective of what happened and what they went through when the attacker walked in. More importantly, for all of us, it was a humble effort to give all of us a small glimpse into the life of these people, of these families, of these kids. So thank you very much for joining. I hope you will. Yes, so maybe once it's done, I'll repeat that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that is it. The excerpt from the film. And yes, I won't quit my day job not reading subtitles. But so I'm going to ask Brother Tariq to come back up. He was the producer of the film. And to maybe speak more, I think, about updates since this film was made and on, especially those who were injured.
Thank you very much. As I said in the beginning, and this is just some extracts from the actual documentary, which is about, what you saw here is about 25 minutes, I believe, and the documentary itself is about 50 minutes. So you can say that you just saw a few parts of the main documentary. But if any one of you is interested in watching the full documentary, please let me know after the program, and I can guide you through where you can watch it. I'll just give quick updates from my recent trip. That was just 3 days back. I was there for 4 days, met with all the families, the survivors, the victim. I was part of the commemoration event that was going on that day. Just to go over some quick numbers, there were about 50 people in the mosque when the attacker walked in with the gun. 6 people obviously died in the mosque. There were 5 other people who were seriously injured, who were taken to the hospital, who stayed in the hospital. One of them was obviously Ayman, who is still in the rehab. Over this last 1 year or so, he has become like one of my closest friends, someone I really look up to. And it's just not me, because I have been visiting him, I have been talking to him all this time. I sent about like 25 reporters to him to do his interview, talk to him, and so on and so forth. And every person that came out, all the reporters that came out from a meeting from him, he said like they have never seen or met anyone like this. In fact, the reporter from BBC, she said that like she has interviewed so many people, but she has never met anyone like this. Obviously, his story is very touching, very emotional, but just as a person. These are some really incredible people. Like when we were back in December, when we were visiting the families, and when we came to know about Ayman's situation, which is basically, he is currently living in rehab. He cannot go to his house to spend time with his wife and kids, because he lives on a fourth floor building in an apartment which is not accessible. So like he's in that situation. And when we told him like this is not good, like we need to have a place for you, accessible house where you can actually like spend time with your family, with your kids. And he was like, we were so shocked because when he said like, we will arrange the money for you, we will raise the money for you, he was like, oh no, don't do that. Like, I'm okay, we'll figure out something work out. There are a lot of other people that are much in more need than me. So to go, if you want to help anyone, just go help them. The community need to come together. We explained him, his wife, and everything, like why it's important for you to spend your time with your wife, because his wife has 3 kids, and one of them actually has some needs, and she's spending 12 hours with you here in the rehab, and she's like trying to juggle between house, kids, and you. It's just very challenging, and that's why you need to have a place. So we started this campaign back in December to raise about $400,000 to buy an accessible house for him, and all thanks to Allah, community member all across Canada. Within a very short time, we were able to raise, like within actually like 3-4 days, we were able to raise $100,000. It slowed down a little bit after that. Then we got some media that covered his story and so on and so forth. And now we are around, I think, $380,000. So we are about $20,000 short of the actual goal. And in fact, I was talking to him just yesterday, Ayman. We actually have a house for him that he wants to buy, like that is close to the mosque and the community. So hopefully, we are very hopeful that in next, I think, like we have another 4 or 5 days that we have to raise this money, and we are very hopeful that we will be able to raise this money and go buy a house for him so that he can live with his wife and kids. Rest of them, like, that's Ayman. Second is Muhammad Qabar, the other person who was seriously injured. He's another person who is still, he couldn't go back to work because he was shot in his feet, and he still has some bullet fragments in his leg, so he cannot stand for a very long time. And by profession, he's a barber. So and we're trying to figure out like how to help him out, like what needs to be. He owns his own business. So I think like about 3 or 4 days in a week, he's opening his store. A couple of people who works for him are coming down to help, but it's very difficult managing like people, paying them salaries, managing paying the rent for the store, and also like helping his family out. Saeed Al-Amari, the person that you saw in the beard, he was shot and he was in coma for 2 months. So he actually had no idea what exactly happened. 2 months in March, when we went back to raise, give the money. At that time, he just came out from coma, and he was telling that he just. I mean, and not just him, like most of the family that I spoke to, that I have been talking to, they actually cannot comprehend the idea or like this knowledge of somebody in Canada walking into a mosque, a religious place, and killing 6 people. We hear this a lot, like south of border, like, because of the gun culture they have. But this is here in Canada. These are people actually, they left their troubled countries, their places, and they moved here. And for them to like just even now, like, just 3-4 days back, I was talking to Safia, and for her to just, like, she's a professor in the university, and for her to like even look back at it and think like somebody actually hated them, or the people that follow certain faith, and decided to walk into a mosque with 2 guns and kill 6 people, injured 19 others. We are very thankful that the other gun didn't work. Otherwise, we were talking about like, casualties in like 20s, 30s, 50s maybe. So these are some updates. I'm outside with a box. If you want to contribute any way to any of the family members or Ayman to buy his house, please talk to me. Please let me know. And if you have any other questions from Quebec itself, I'm there to answer. I have been spending a lot of time with them. I might be going back again next month. In fact, Dawan, a team who produced the documentary, is doing like a monthly trip to Quebec. Because we have a counselor, like an imam, who has some expertise with counseling people. So we go every month, do some kind of family program with everyone, and also do counseling to the youth, the people who were in the mosque at that time, and just to help them out, support them, and see. So if you have any questions, please do let me know. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you. Yes, so if you want to support any of the project that Dawanet is doing, you can visit dawanet.ca, or like even if you just Google it, you will be able to find this thing. DAWANET.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Tarek. And like Tarek said, that eventually the film will be available for everyone to see, and then you can visit the website for more information on that. So now we're just about to move into the second portion of our event, which is a reflection on the context of Islamophobia in which this act of violence took place. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, but before I do that, I just wanted to share with you. So Noor Cultural Center, many of you know, sorry, Louis?
Would it be possible when the film will be available to put the link on the new website to send it as email to all the people who are connected?
Good idea, Louis. And yeah, so we'll consult with Brother Tarek and Dawanet, and that's a good idea for us to share the film so everyone can have access to it. Thank you. So many of you know that Noor Cultural Center, we do a lot of education on Islamophobia, and one element of that is producing reports on Islamophobia. So we have one, and we have some printouts of it available. It's called Islamophobia in Mainstream Canadian Media, Muslims as Terrorists, and the way that it is formatted is that we take incidents of violence in which Muslims were the perpetrators, so commonly known as terrorism, and incidents of violence in which Muslims were the primary victims, and analyze media coverage about those events. And the discrepancies in coverage are attributable to Islamophobia, so the particular construction of Muslims as violent, and also the relative devaluation of Muslim lives. So that report, this report is available online, and all the links are embedded in the document in the online version, but I know some people prefer the print copy. So I'm just going to pass it around. So please just take a look and pass it along. And if you want a print copy, either for yourself or to share, and you're very welcome to do that, please just come and speak to me afterwards, and I can give one to you. Otherwise, you can see this and all of our reports with the links at noorculturalcenter.ca. In the we have resource sections, one on Islam and Muslims, and one on social justice and nonviolence. So you can see it there as well, but I'll pass this around, and please let me know if you want a copy. So. Make sure you pass it along. Okay, so we'll start with the reflection portion of this event. As my mom mentioned, Dr. Perry, who's an expert on hate crimes and who has been mapping out the landscape of white supremacy in Canada, is unfortunately not available, one of the hazards of having any event in winter. But thankfully, thanks to modern technology, we do not need her here in order to hear from her. So we'll be showing an interview that Dr. Perry did on TVO's The Agenda in 2016. So that's about 15 minutes, so we'll show that now. But I'll just read a brief bio of her. So Dr. Barbara Perry is a professor and the undergraduate program director of criminology at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, UOIT. Dr. Perry has written extensively in the area of hate crime. Some of her books include In the Name of Hate, Understanding Hate Crimes, Hate and Bias Crime, a reader, and The Silent Victims, Hate Crimes Against Native Americans. Dr. Perry has also written on policing diverse communities, including work on social control in Indigenous communities. She has made substantial contributions to the limited scholarship on hate crime in Canada. Most recently, she has contributed to a scholarly understanding of anti-Muslim violence, hate crime against queer trans communities, and the community impacts of hate crime.
Talk of homegrown terrorism in Canada tends to focus on foreign influences such as ISIS, but that misses other all too common kinds of extremist violence. For example, the killing of police officers in Moncton, New Brunswick in 2014 and in Edmonton, Alberta in 2015. Joining us now to explain the other terror threat, here's Barbara Perry. She's a professor of criminology at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, and we are happy to welcome you here. And grateful you made the long drive from Oshawa to get here.
Not so long, I took the train.
Oh, even better.
But
all
thank
right.
you, an
better.
honor and a pleasure to be here.
Not at all. Let's just put up these graphics before we get started here on our conversation. This, according to internal CSIS documents obtained from the Toronto Star, lone actor attacks more often come from right-wing extremist ideologies than from jihadist extremism, and data compiled by the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society shows that in the last 15 years, 59% of lone actor attacks were ideologically motivated by right-wing extremist ideology. Let's just do it. I think off the top that's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people who, when they hear terror, automatically equate it with, you know, Islamic extremism and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's become the discourse. That's become the emphasis for us and the priority.
So we need to rethink our notion of what terrorism is these days. Is that the point?
Well, I think be more expansive in our definition, our understanding of what terrorism is, what extremism is in the Canadian context and worldwide as well. It's not just in our country where we see that disproportionate attention. You've clearly seen the headlines out of Europe where right-wing parties are very powerful, as well as more informal groups on the street. So yeah.
So my hunch is people, when you say Islamofascism or Islamic extremist terrorism, people know what you mean. Mm-hmm. When we talk about right-wing extremist terrorism, maybe less so. So do you want to tell us what it is?
Oh, absolutely, sure. For me, and the definitions are legion, and so no real consensus there, but I really see two main streams, and one is an emphasis on nationalism as defined through racial and ethnic and gender lenses as well. Also tied in very often with a anti-statist or anti-authoritarian perception as well. In particular, in the current context, the state is held responsible for the undeserved rights gained by minority groups, women, LGBTQ communities, that sort of thing. So that's really the core. And then offshoots of that, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitism, obviously, a whole array of isms that follow from that as well.
Is it a coordinated, international, organized effort in the way that many people see Islamic extremism being?
It is international. It's very much a global phenomenon, and it has been, for generations, really. Because the homeland really is Europe and Western Europe in particular, and so there's this hearkening back to that purity of the white race that derived from Europe, and so you see a lot of connection between North American and European extremists, but even more so now with the access to online venues, whether it's Facebook or websites or just email exchanges that sort of help them to coalesce around these ideologies.
And why would we call it right-wing extremism?
I think the right really refers to that traditional left-right ideological spectrum, liberalism, conservatism. So there really is an emphasis amongst these actors on reclaiming traditional conservative values around patriarchy, around white privilege, those sorts of pieces.
Let me follow up on that because, again, we're going to make these comparisons to Islamic extremism as we go along here. And, for many people, that's pretty clear. They want to terrorize, they want to establish a caliphate, they want to bring Sharia law, right? I mean, the agenda's pretty upfront. What's the agenda for a right-wing extremist?
It's more reactionary in the sense that it's an attempt from their perspective to right the balance or correct the balance that has swung too far. Which way am I going? Too far to the left in terms of recognizing the rights of what have traditionally been marginalized communities, and immigration policy, multiculturalism, all of those pieces are a part of it, to the detriment of white privilege from their perspective.
And what kind of terrorist act is the sort of coin of the realm for this part?
The terrorist acts in particular they're very, very different than what we understand, what we think of as, the more common, or I shouldn't say more common, the more representative forms of jihadi-related extremism, which we understand to be, bombs and mass destruction, that sort of thing, which isn't the case. But in these cases, there's a lot of one-on-one violence, but also sort of campaigns of violence, if you will, sometimes directed towards particular individuals from racialized communities, for example, or families. And sometimes, as we've seen even just in the last 5 or 6 years, campaigns targeted towards racialized and minority communities in a particular city or in a particular region, on a daily basis and going for weeks, but sometimes months.
So a guy who says, I'm going to take the biggest gun I can and go into a church in Charleston, South Carolina and kill some people, that's an example.
Yeah, that's clearly an example.
On the other hand, the bomb, this is back when Bill Clinton was president, the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, which killed 160,
Yeah,
170
yeah,
people,
yeah.
something like that? I mean, that's part of it too, obviously,
Yes.
is it not?
Yeah.
So they do bomb- they do bomb
absolutely
buildings.
do. Yeah, we haven't had cases like that. I should back off. We haven't had sort of that dramatic a case in the Canadian context, but we have had, plenty of fire bombs and arson attacks on mosques and synagogues, for example. Not so much directed towards state agencies as towards particular communities.
You've mapped this out, I think. Sheldon, you want to bring this up? Let's. Here's the data on the distribution of right-wing extremist groups across the country. Take us through this map, if you like, east to west, if you want, and sort of give us a sense about where it's all located.
And I'm going to say at the outset that part of this data I think really reflects the attention that's paid, the differential attention that's paid to right-wing activity and hate crime generally across the country. That there are some areas that are, law enforcement, for example, is much more cognizant of the issue. But also, I think the second thing to say is that there's a lot of movement back and forth amongst these regions. So we really do see that concentration in Quebec, and in particular, skinhead movement in Quebec, which surprised me. I thought skinhead movement was dead, but alive and well in Quebec. But then Western Ontario, Alberta, both in Edmonton and Calgary and some of the outlying regions, and then the Lower Mainland in British Columbia are really the hotbeds. But there's a lot of movement back and forth when it gets too hot from a law enforcement perspective. For example, in one area, then they might move on to come back to Ontario and then back to BC, that sort of thing. So there is a lot of movement. But two, just in terms of the sizes of the groups, they vary dramatically. One law enforcement officer referred to some as three-man wrecking crews. It really is only a couple of guys, typically guys, who have set themselves the task of cleansing their own little community, whatever that might be. But some of the skinhead groups in particular are, much larger than that in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Earlier in the 90s, some of them were, closer to 100. But that we sort of backed away from those large groups.
As I look at Atlantic Canada, Sheldon, I don't know if you want to bring that map back up, but if you look at Atlantic Canada, you've got very little there, despite the fact that it is a much less diverse population than, say, here in Ontario. Any theories as to why that would be?
Well, I think, as you said, it is not a very diverse community. So whatever, even just talking in terms of hate crime, whatever violence might occur there is typically directed towards the Aboriginal community. So the movement hasn't really grown, or at least we've not had reports, and sort of our informants weren't able to identify much in that respect. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. I think especially, areas bordering Quebec, there's a little bit of spillover in that area.
Okay, let's do, Sheldon, graphic at the bottom, the board number 1. A spokesperson for CSIS had this to say about all of this. Right-wing extremist circles appear to be fragmented and primarily pose a threat to public order and not to national security. Tell me about that distinction. Not to public order, or excuse me, a threat to public order, but not to national security. What's the difference?
Yeah, and that's something I hear quite often when I'm interviewing law enforcement and intelligence is, why are we not paying attention to this? And that's a very common refrain. And so, yeah, there is a tendency to describe the acts of right-wing extremists as simply criminal events, threats to public order, as reflection of individual pathology rather than cultural pathology, as we tend to do with Islamic inspired violence. And so I think the problem with that is that it doesn't recognize that threats to disparate communities across the country on a regular basis are also threats to our national sense of well-being in terms of being direct threats to our constitutional values. And how is that not extremist? Even in the case of Justin Bork, who shot, as we know, in Moncton, 3 RCMP officers, that was not characterized as terrorism. There was one headline. I absolutely would. Yeah, using those same definitions. There was even a headline that said, yes, he terrorized a community, but he was not a terrorist. But he was motivated by, ideological, some of those same threads that I talked about earlier on. Anti-statism, pro-gun rights, which is unusual in the Canadian context, but that was him. And, some of these more traditional right-wing ideologies.
Back when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, there were 3 people arrested into an alleged plot to open fire at a mall in Halifax. And the Justice Minister at the time, who was Peter MacKay, called these alleged perpetrators murderous misfits. He says the attack does not appear to have been culturally motivated, therefore not linked to terrorism. What do you think about that characterization?
Yeah, I think it was an inapt characterization. It was quite clear, I think, after the fact that these youth were inspired by right-wing and white supremacist ideologies. They had some of the literature, the propaganda was on their websites and their website history. And so, yeah, clearly they were ideologically motivated. Again, sort of saw a mission to make a statement about the changing demographics and the changing policies in their part of the world, but also, across Canada as well.
So that reflects a bit of a mindset that if it's not related to Islam, it's not terrorism,
Right.
which you think we need to change.
Yeah.
Do we not take right-wing extremism seriously enough in this country?
I don't think we do, and I think we don't really recognize the extent of the threat. So for the report that I've shared with you, from 1980 to about mid-2015, we identified over 120 incidents associated with right-wing extremist individuals and groups, and just in 28, just in the last, since 2010, which is far more than the number of incidents associated with Islamic extremism. Yet, again, we're not counting that. Yeah.
If the idea at the end of the day is to terrorize, does it make a difference whether it's rooted in Islam or rooted in right-wing extremism?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the definition that I use for hate crime, which is what my work generally revolves around, is an act intended to intimidate individuals and communities, which is very much the same as sort of our federal definition of terrorism. They're very much parallel.
Okay, in which case, though, are there differences between those two phenomena as well?
There are differences in the way I think that we understand it and count it. If it's not, so I ran across a great statement yesterday that compared the two in terms of calling one local and lesser and one global and greater, which is still, that's the perception. That's not how this person characterized it, but that's a perception. And again, if you want to unpack that, as I mentioned earlier on, the right-wing extremist movement is also global and has the capacity for greater levels of violence. You mentioned the El Fadar Mura attack. That's
in
clearly,
Oklahoma City.
that's clearly an example of that. So I think that there is the potential in both within both groups for the same level and kind of violence. Now, fortunately, in Canada, we haven't seen, in fact, in either. With respect to either end of that spectrum, if you like, we haven't seen those really dramatic, mass casualties.
The federal government has announced the creation of this new position called a de-radicalization officer. Countering violent extremism, CVE programs, they're being developed.
Yeah.
Do you think countering right-wing violent extremism will fall under this rubric? Because I'm not sure that's what they've intended, right?
No, it could very well, and it should. I think that we need to follow the example that we've seen in the UK with their PREVENT program, which was a very similar sort of strategy, which was heavily criticized for, having virtually nothing to say about right-wing extremism. So I think it's important very early on to broaden that conversation and to include those of us who are paying attention. And it's not just academics. There are law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies across the country who are paying attention. So it's important to have them as part of the conversation as well, and to draw on that.
And let's remember why, because there are more right-wing extremism acts of terrorism than Islamic-related acts of terrorism.
Yes, historically
The
that has been the
numbers
case.
show that to be the case.
Just in the last decade even.
Okay, again, in which case, if you're talking about putting into place some kind of de-radicalization process, would the nuts and bolts of that kind of a program be the same if you were a right-wing extremist versus motivated by jihad? Yeah,
because many of the reasons that people are vulnerable to radicalization are very similar, it makes sense in many respects to engage in similar activities, especially using formers as main actors, key actors in those initiatives. But the difficulty, I think, with right-wing extremism is that it will send sort of conflicting messages, because in the broader culture, we see these same messages: anti-immigration stance, Islamophobia, whether it's in the media, whether it's in political rhetoric. So that is part and parcel of our fabric, and yet we want to engage in counterterrorism that denies those same ideologies and counters those same ideologies. So I think we have to do a lot of work at the broader cultural level as well as at the level of extremists.
Professor Perry, we thank you for taking the train in from Oshawa to give us a new way of thinking about this subject. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for taking it.
Barbara Perry, Professor, Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology.
This interview was taped in 2016, so obviously before the Quebec mosque shooting, which should give us a sense of the fact that even if that violence against Muslims wasn't necessarily on the national radar before the Quebec mosque shooting, it's clearly a phenomenon that very much precedes it or pre-exists it. So now I'll bring up the panelists who we have in the flesh for us. And first, I'll introduce Dr. Ingrid Mattsson, and then Aziza Kanji. Where are my notes? Thanks, Mom. You don't want me going off script, probably. Okay, so first, Ingrid, I can set that up for you. Dr. Ingrid Mattsson is the London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies at Huron University College at Western University in Canada. Her writings, both academic and public, focus primarily on Quran interpretation, Islamic theological ethics, and interfaith relations. Her book, The Story of the Quran, is an academic bestseller and was chosen by the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities for inclusion in its Bridging Cultures program. Dr. Mattsson is a recipient of numerous awards, as well as honorary doctorates from Trinity College, Hartford, and the Chicago Theological Seminary. She is frequently consulted by the media and has served as an expert witness. And that's just part of her bio that I clipped, but so let me just, you have to click right here. Where did you put it? No, it's on the desktop. Figure out how to use this.
It's just the,
Or is it this one?
it's just you press one
Oh, no.
on the side.
Right. So this is to the side, back, forward, and back. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I'm so happy to be at Noor Cultural Center, which I've admired from afar for a long time, but it's actually my first visit. It's just such a beautiful place that reflects the beautiful people who run the programs here. God bless them all, really. So it's an honor for me to be here. I want to ask, does anyone here know what hangry means? Hangry. What does it mean? No, it means, it means hungry and angry. You're angry, you're irritable because you're hungry. So I only say that because I just found out that that word, which has been invented or started to be used, I don't know who invented it, has been added to the dictionary. So it's now an actual dictionary word. It is also the case, and this annoys me, frankly, to no end, but the word literally now in the dictionary has both its traditional meaning and its opposite meaning as valid. So you know how so many people said, oh, I literally couldn't get out of bed, but they don't mean literally, they mean metaphorically. So both the meaning of they actually could not and metaphorically are both valid dictionary meanings now. Now, why do I say that? I say that because language means what we say it means. I mean, words evolve, their meaning evolves, people use language, and then they're defined and the content is filled by how people
use those words. That is why every year there are many, many new words that are added to the dictionary, words like hangry that are inventions, or words like literally that have had a meaning for a long time and now are given a completely opposite meaning at the same time as having their existing meaning. I say this because, unfortunately, the discussion about Islamophobia for at least a year in Canada has revolved around semantics. And this is just absurd. And what do I mean by semantics? What I mean is that people will say, well, Islamophobia means literally a phobia of Islam, and a phobia means a fear, so this isn't the right word to use because it doesn't truly reflect what people feel. It's not that we're afraid of Islam, it's that I don't like religion at all, or I don't like Islam. I don't agree with this religion, and I shouldn't have to be called Islamophobic if I don't like Islam. So this has all been a huge distraction. Unfortunately, the debate about M103 revolved around semantics. So we need to get away from that, and we need to push back on that. We use the word anti-Semitism every single day. Anti-Semitism, literally, you are against Semitic people. There are Jews who are not Semitic people. Yet anti-Semitism means hatred of Jews. There are Semites who are not Jewish, but anti-Semitism does not mean hatred of Arab people, even though literally it should. So why do we not have a problem with using the term anti-Semitism? Because we know what it means, because it's a word that we started to use and the content was filled, and no one would deny that there is a problem with anti-Semitism. Let's use why would we not simply just deal with anti-Semitism rather than spend all of our time in Parliament and the media debating whether this is exactly the right term to use? So let's not fall into these semantics. And we should realize that this is a huge distraction to avoid the problem, right? It's almost childish. It's almost like a technique that if you're trying to find out, you know, which of your kids knocked over the vase in the house, and then they start to say, well, no, I didn't knock it over. Well, no, because actually I hit a ball and the ball hit it over, right? I mean, it's just avoiding the problem. So when we talk about Islamophobia, the definition that actually Noor Cultural Center has used that was arrived by a number of people is Islamophobia is defined as an unfounded or irrational fear and or hatred of Islam or Muslims or people perceived to be Muslim, leading to violence and systemic discrimination. So it's not a rational critique, it's not that you don't like religion at all and you're an atheist. None of these things are what Islamophobia means. Islamophobia kills. It kills people. Killed people in Quebec. It killed these three, a year before Quebec, it killed 3 lovely young people in North Carolina, murderously shot in the head in their own home by their neighbor. Property is ruined. And it's not, I mean, you could paint over a sign of an Islamic center that is a swastika on, but the reason why it's a problem, why does someone paint a swastika on a sign? Why does someone spray paint go home? Is it because they want to busy people with having to, scrape that off and clean it and paint a new sign? That's not why. It's not the property damage, it's intimidation, right? It's the intimidation factor. They want people to feel afraid going there. They want to prevent people, they want people to be so afraid and intimidated that they don't feel free anymore to go to these spaces. This is the point. And terrorism that's the goal of terrorism as well, is intimidation. It's to make people feel so uneasy about going to certain places that they avoid that. So it's not primarily the act itself, it's intimidation. And this is what we see with Islamophobia and why the focus even only on murders or beatings is problematic. Because the real cost is that so many people are feeling intimidated, uneasy, that they have to hide. And we have tons of evidence from therapists, social workers, school counselors, that especially our young people are just terrified that someone will find out that they're Muslim because they think they will be hurt, they will be discriminated against. And what's really interesting is that Islamophobia, you saw the definition, is that it is this hatred towards those who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim. There are many non-Muslims who have been violently assaulted because they were perceived to be Muslim. Many are Sikhs. Many Sikh people in Canada and the United States have been assaulted because mistakenly, like I saw this one headline in the newspaper, many Sikhs mistaken victims of hate crimes. So is there a right victim of a hate crime? Like, is the problem just that, well, we have to educate these haters about the difference between Sikhs and Muslims so they can actually attack and beat up Muslims rather than Sikhs? So it's really a very strange kind of thing. Like, we feel more sorry for Sikhs who are attacked as in a mistaken hate crime than a Muslim who would be attacked. So it's a very strange thing. Of course, black people are attacked as mistakenly as Muslims. Hindus, in one of the first hate crimes that occurred in Texas after 9/11, one was a Hindu, one was a Sikh, and one was a Muslim, but they're all what? Brown, right? They're all brown people. And that is part of what we mean of Islamophobia as racism. That's part of the piece, is that there is a conflation of racism and Islam itself is racialized. And again, is the solution that we need to educate people that all brown people aren't Muslim, and that if they're going to attack a brown person, that they really should make sure that brown person is not Hindu or Sikh or something else, but they're actually a Muslim to hate them. That's clearly not the problem. So what we see is that racism is a big part of the issue, and that of course there are people who intervene, who try to intervene in Islamophobic attacks, like these two men who were among three men who intervened to try to prevent an Islamophobic attack in Portland. And it was Islamophobic. The person was saying, go back to Saudi Arabia, etc., things like that. And two of the people died. These two men died in that attack, trying to prevent the Islamophobic attack. So this is, this is not just about, it should be enough that Muslims deserve safety and security, but Islamophobic violence affects everyone, not just Muslims. Now, there are those who say, well, just to get away from the word Islamophobia, or to expand it greater, or for people to really understand the complex dynamics, we should really understand that Islamophobia is anti-Muslim racism. And the elements of racism that are clear in Islamophobia. And there is this very good, it's a syllabus, an Islamophobia is Racism syllabus that's online, that gives a lot of readings for those who want to do further reading. And they say, that we really have to analyze the structures that bring in Islamophobia. It's not just people haven't met a Muslim, or they don't know anything about Islam. There's a history here, a history of empire building, that Islamophobia is linked to white supremacy, slavery, settler colonialism, to the security logics of war and imperialism. So there are a lot of factors that go into this. And this picture just kind of shows the whole, this one sign kind of pulls it all together, right? This is an anti-Barack Obama sign. Of course, Barack Obama being attacked for being a Muslim, right? A black man who's attacked for being a Muslim, which he wasn't, but as if that is a problem. And this whole idea, go back to Kenya, that this shows the overlap with anti-migrant sentiment and white supremacy. Because the policies, the anti-migrant policies that we see completely overlap with white supremacy, whether it's in Europe or the United States, and you can tell me whether or not there have been any whiffs of this in Canada or not, but certainly white supremacy is a big part of it. And you know, I'm a white person. I'm a white person. You know, all my roots go back to Scandinavia, Northern Germany, and Ireland. So I am a white person, I'm a Muslim. It's not like I hate white people. Some of my best relatives are white people. I'm one myself. So but this is the reality of white supremacy, is that there's such an oblivion of our privilege. And you know, one of the examples I would give is I hear people say, oh, you know, we need to go back to our heritage, our cultural heritage. I've had people say that, oh, it seems so strange to have a mosque in Nunavut. Did you know there's a mosque in Nunavut? Yeah. With, you know, brown people in that mosque. Well, there's a church in Nunavut too. Is that strange? Is it strange? People say, well, it's strange to have, you know, dark-colored people in Nunavut. Really? You know, Christianity and Islam both came from the exact same area in the world, in the Middle East. Isn't it a little, is it strange that we have a church in Nunavut? It's only as strange as it is to have a mosque there. And that because the further people go north, the whiter they should be, right? Well, there were people, and there still are people in Nunavut before white people got there, and they aren't white-skinned. So this idea that, you know, that this is our land, our homeland, shows the link with settler colonialism. I realize that this language is kind of, it can be convoluted and a little annoying and a little jargony, but this is the reality of the situation. We can only say that a white majority population and the religion and culture of the white majority population belongs in this land, is the heritage of this land, only if we ignore the fact that white people came here as settler colonialists, right? That's the only way we can say those kind of things. And so this is why Islamophobia is linked to settler colonialism. Denying hate is a common tactic of bigots, and this is another reaction to discussions about Islamophobia. Well, Islamophobia isn't really real, or I'm just, you know, we can criticize, it's just people wanting to deny our freedom of speech, to criticize Islam. There's not really, you know, look, there are some successful Muslims here, there's no real Islamophobia. Again and again, denying hate, denying racism, denying prejudice is the most common tactic of bigots. That is why Holocaust denial is rampant. Holocaust denial. I mean, with all of the evidence of the Holocaust, all of the evidence of the Holocaust, the fact that it only occurred, you know, a few decades ago, yet there is rampant Holocaust denial. And from many of the same people who are Islamophobic. So this is one of the oldest tricks in the book. You know, denying that residential schools and settler colonialism was a bad thing. Some people, we see, denying that it was a bad thing. Denying that racism, anti-black racism is a thing. So when we need to, this is why we need to understand Islamophobia as a form of racism, because when we do that, we're going to start to see similarities. We're going to say, oh yes, the same kind of tactics are being used for those who want to deny Islamophobia as those who want to deny anti-Semitism, who want to deny anti-Black racism, who want to deny that there is a major foundation fundamental problem with hatred of Indigenous people in this country. It is the conflation, you know, these things take on different flavors over time. But really today, I would say that one of the biggest overlaps, and our premier has just walked into the room. Welcome. Really one of the biggest overlaps, I would say, when we look at Islamophobia as racism is the anti-immigrant sentiment. And that is really a global problem. It is as pronounced in Europe as it is in the United States, and as we saw perhaps in some previous governments in Canada as well. You know, you have just a simple example. I could have gone on for hours about this, but a simple example, the first baby of the year, you know, the new year, every country has what's the first New Year's baby. This beautiful little girl is born to this couple in Austria. Pictures put on the newspaper, front page of the newspaper, as is everywhere. And the hatred, comments, ongoing, flowing towards this, not just the parents, but the actual baby, is just shocking. And it's just a symbol, a symbolic example of this conflation of Islamophobia with anti-migrant sentiment. And I'm pretty much at the end of my time, I think. Very interesting thing. I mean, if we want to think about how Islamophobia affects our society broader, in terms of democracy, right? In terms of civic, the bonds that keep us together as a society, civic harmony. Very interesting, you know, Facebook ran the numbers, and as required by the US Congress, was able to uncover that Russian bots instrumentalized Islamophobia to create discord and division during the last presidential campaign. They did not create Islamophobia, they instrumentalized it. So what they did is they took existing hatred and they amplified it, they used it as a model to create division. So for example, this protest, it was, you know, I can't remember what it was called, anti-Sharia or something protest in some, God knows who knows where, in Texas, was actually organized on Facebook by Russian bots, but real people turned up. And the result was that in a real town where people live, you had hatred, anger, yelling, a fracturing of society. So we have to be smarter than that. We have to realize that these sentiments can be instrumentalized and hurt not just, you know, Muslims, not just brown people who are mistaken for Muslims, not just, you know, white people who intervene in Islamophobic attacks like in Portland and are murdered, but actually can be used to create such discord and hatred within society that our very social bonds within our communities are fractured. So this is a serious issue. It's not a marginal issue. It's not an issue just about us. And I don't think anyone can say it better than Hassan Minhaj. We, as Canadians, we get a lot from the United States. And it's flowing in, the kind of hatred and garbage is flowing in. But of course, we have our own homegrown hatred as well. But it is a major problem, and I don't think we should be so comfortable that we think that now, we have a prime minister who's very eloquent in talking about inclusion and diversity. I'm an Americanized Canadian. I'm a Canadian who went and lived in America for over 23 years and moved back to Canada 5 years ago. And I lived through Bush and then lived through Obama, and that was a breath of fresh air, and worked with him, and all sorts of things built up. Wonderful. And who followed Obama? I mean, it's the exact opposite. So we have to be really aware and not comfortable, not thinking that these things are that we're on some kind of natural historical trajectory, that where things are always getting better. We need to continually work. We need to work at it. We need to do our part to uncover the techniques of racism, of Islamophobia, of all of these forms of hatred that really are fundamentally supported primarily by people whose main goal really is to split societies, is to sow chaos, to sow hatred. It is no surprise that the most Islamophobic, most anti-immigrant president in recent history in the United States is also the person who is trying to dismantle every protection that the state can provide to communities, people, the environment, labor rights. It is a form of dismantling what keeps us together as people. So it is critical that all of us understand that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. So I'm going to introduce Aziza, our next speaker. But as Ingrid mentioned, our Premier Kathleen Wynne just walked in the room with her partner, Jane. So thank you, Kathleen and Jane, so much for being here. And then I also just wanted to point out Brother Mazhar Shafiq, who's also here. He's a Liberal candidate running in Scarborough Centre in the upcoming provincial election. So please speak to him afterwards if you have questions. Well, we've already introduced Councillor Shelley, but why not another round of applause? Shelley Carroll, thank you. So I'll introduce Aziza, a brief bio. Aziza is Director of Programming at Noor Cultural Centre. She has a Bachelor of Health Sciences from McMaster, a JD from University of Toronto's Faculty of Law, and an LLM, Masters of Law, Islamic Law Specialization from the School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London. She writes in the Toronto Star every other Thursday and speaks regularly in academic and community settings on issues of race, law, and social justice. And as Aziza mentioned before, she's also my sister, so my mom assures me that when she refers to her as number one and me as number two, she's just referring to birth order, but still to be determined. So, Aziza, and you have your presentation as well, right?
Yeah, but I'll speak from here.
Okay.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to all our sisters and brothers who are here with us today from all the different communities that Noor is very lucky to call our friends. And thank you also to Professor Matson. You spoke about how you've been admiring us from afar for many years, but the long-distance admiration is completely mutual. We've been admiring you for so long, and so it was such an honor and a pleasure to have you join us with us on this anniversary of violence and terror. 1 year after the Quebec Mosque shooting, it is disheartening and disturbing how little our conversations around Islamophobia, around Islam and around Muslims have really changed in Canada. So that even 1 year after 6 Muslim men were killed in a mosque after prayers, Muslims are still being forced to prove over and over and over again that Islamophobia actually exists in this country. Far from being at the point where we can begin talking about solutions to Islamophobia, many are still in denial about the existence of the problem. A survey that was conducted just a few weeks after the Quebec mosque shooting found that a majority of Canadians were actually opposed to M103, which was a non-binding, non-legally changing parliamentary motion to simply study the problem of Islamophobia. A majority of Canadians were against this because they felt that the problem of Islamophobia had been exaggerated just a few weeks after 6 Muslim men were killed in a mosque. And we see this continuing Islamophobia denialism even with the government's response to Islamophobia. In the recently released report that was the result of the study that was mandated by M103, this motion to study Islamophobia, the report was released just a few days ago, the same week as we marked the 1-year anniversary of the Quebec mosque shooting. And yet this report spends much more time debating the linguistics of Islamophobia. Should we be calling it Islamophobia? What does Islamophobia mean? Rather than studying and analyzing the systemic, state-sponsored manifestations of Islamophobia. As Professor Matson has explained to us very clearly, these discussions about definitions are a distraction. We can easily define the term, say what we mean by it, and move on. As we know that all language is socially constructed, we decide on a definition and then we talk about it. Instead, these endless debates about whether or not Islamophobia is an apt term are used to derail any conversation about the substance of Islamophobia itself, even though we know that people are being killed because of Islamophobia, that mosques are being vandalized because of Islamophobia, that people are being terrorized by Islamophobia. And so even 1 year after the Quebec mosque shooting, we see that Islamophobia denialism is still very prevalent, even while the attitudes that make people fear and hate Muslims are still extremely pervasive in Canada, and not just in Quebec, because we've seen with many of the memorializations around the Quebec mosque shooting that much of the attention has been on the pathologies, the racist pathologies that are in Quebec, but we see that these attitudes towards Muslims are still very widespread. A recent survey by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, for example, found that less than 50% of people in Ontario had positive views about Muslims, and more than 40% thought that it was reasonable for police and state security agencies to be racially profiling Muslims, at least sometimes, in the name of national security. The problem with addressing these Islamophobic views is that for the people who hold them, they are not seen as being expressions of racism. Instead, they are understood to merely be a natural response to the way that Muslims and Islam actually are. I can't tell you the number of times I have been giving a talk about Islamophobia, and people in the audience will tell me, well, if that's Islamophobia, then I'm proud to be an Islamophobe because fear of Muslims is reasonable, because we know that Muslims are terrorists, that Muslims are misogynists, that Muslims are a source of danger. A survey that was done a few years ago, indeed, found that a significant percentage of Canadians, something like 40% or higher, thought that Islamophobia, if it exists, is mostly Muslims' fault. And so the problem is not simply that some people like Alexandre Bissonnette hate Muslims so much that he would go on a shooting spree inside a mosque shortly after men had finished their prayers. The problem is that the stereotypes and myths and attitudes about Muslims and Islam that lead to such hatred are not only pervasive, but they are constantly being rationalized so that people do not recognize them as racism. Instead, they think that they are a realistic and rational response to the way that Muslims are. And these stereotypes and myths are still, even in the wake of the Quebec mosque shooting, are still being rationalized and legitimized and propagated in our mainstream media, as well as in our government discourses about national security and Islam and Muslims. We know from studies that have been conducted in the United States that violence committed by Muslims receives 5 times more coverage in Canadian media than acts of violence that are committed by non-Muslims, including acts of violence that are committed against Muslims. In Canada also, we know that the night that the Quebec mosque shooting happened, CBC's The National devoted 5 minutes of coverage to the shooting that night. In stark contrast, a few months later, when an act of terror was committed by Muslims in London in the UK, the show devoted 5 hours providing live coverage and updates about the situation. And the differences we know are not only quantitative, they are also qualitative, and they have persisted even with this supposedly new awareness we have about Islamophobia in the wake of the January shooting. Islamophobic acts of violence are constantly represented as isolated incidents. The connection between what happened in Quebec or what happened in the Finsbury Park Mosque attack that happened in London a few months later are never connected to the fabric of violence that is committed against Muslims. From as many as 2 million Muslims dead in the war on terror to drone attacks that kill Muslims who are marking funerals or weddings in their communities, to the hundreds of mosques across Europe and North America that have been vandalized or arsoned. These connections are never made. Instead, when an act of Islamophobia does occur, if it is covered at all in our media, it is represented as an isolated incident. In stark contrast, when acts of violence are committed by Muslims, we see how they are all represented as part of a larger fabric of Muslim terror that is posing a threat to the West. We saw this in the types of questions that Steve Paikin was asking Barbara Perry in the interview that we just saw, where Steve Paikin said, well, the threat of Islamic terrorism is global and coordinated, whereas the threat of right-wing extremism is not. We know this isn't true. We know that the right-wing extremist groups here are offshoots of groups frequently that are active in the US and in Europe. But the connections are never drawn between the violence that right-wing extremists occur, whereas acts of violence committed by Muslims are overconnected so that events that are linked by nothing except for the religious identity of their perpetrators are knit together to present a tapestry of Muslim violence as a whole. On a conversation it was a national conversation about national security and terrorism hosted on CBC's The National by Peter Mansbridge. Peter Mansbridge, when introducing the conversation, mentioned a whole series of acts of violence that had been committed by Muslims, from 9/11 to the Brussels attack, to the Nice attacks, to attacks in Nigeria committed by Boko Haram. He did not mention in his introduction the Quebec mosque shooting, which was the most fatal act of ideologically linked violence to happen in Canada since 1989, and yet that was not mentioned as an act of terror. This perpetual marginalization of right-wing violence, white supremacist violence, and violence against Muslims is also evident in the way that state security agencies approach the question of terrorism, even in the wake of the Quebec mosque shooting. Since that night on January 29th, 2017, Canadian security agencies have released 2 reports on the threat to national security that is facing Canada. The first report by CSIS, which is Canadian Security and Intelligence Services, released just a few weeks after the Quebec mosque shooting, did not mention the shooting at all. Instead, it focused entirely on Muslims as the source of terrorism in Canada. And then at the end of last year, Public Safety Canada released a summary of the terrorist threat facing Canada. Out of 25 pages, only 2 paragraphs were devoted to right-wing and white supremacist violence, even though, as we know from statistics, the toll of right-wing and white supremacist violence is many times greater than the toll of violence committed by Muslims. The Quebec mosque shooting alone killed 3 times as many people as acts of violence called Muslim terror ever have in Canada. And yet it is perpetually marginalized in the way that the state publicly represents the threat of terrorism to Canadian citizens. In the Public Safety Canada report, it justifies the lack of attention paid to right-wing and white supremacist violence by saying these groups are mainly just active online. But we know that this isn't true. You don't have to conduct undercover surveillance to know that white supremacist and right-wing groups are active. They commit their aggression openly and brazenly as a sign of their power. And, we said Barbara Perry isn't here with us in person, but she's here with us tonight in many different manifestations. One of them is that she has shared her slide presentation with us. And so I'm just going to show a few slides from the presentation. And I know I'm getting the sign to hurry up. But I'm just going to show a few slides from the presentation showing pictures, and these are just publicly available pictures of white supremacist violence. Deej, can you open it? Or?
It's open, isn't it?
Oh, okay. And so this is a march. You can see some of the signs. Soldiers of Odin is a group inspired from Europe, which is an anti-immigrant group. They're one of the groups that have been conducting patrols along the border, watching refugees coming into Canada from the United States. La Meute, which is based in Quebec. The Three Percenters, which is an armed patriot group inspired by a group in the US. They've been conducting live-fire paramilitary training exercises. And yet when asked about them by Vice magazine, the RCMP said, we're only concerned with criminal activity, not the types of things the Three Percenters are doing. Pegida is another group that is inspired by Europe, and the World Coalition Against Islam, they're so organized, you see that they even have t-shirts. We don't even have t-shirts, we're not that organized. And yet, what we see is that instead of focusing on this, our state security agencies are still focused predominantly on Muslims, so that they target Muslim men for security surveillance who go play paintball, while Alexandre Bissonnette, the shooter in the Quebec Mosque shooting, went to practice his murderous skills at a gun range without coming under any kind of surveillance. They focus their attentions on Muslims so that CSIS agents continue to pay harassing visits to Muslims at their schools or their places of work, while no Canadian politician even bothered to visit Ayman Darbali, the man who was paralyzed by trying to save people from harm in the course of the Quebec Mosque shooting. And so we know that there have been calls for a day of remembrance and action on Islamophobia. But one day of remembrance and action cannot counter Islamophobia as usual the rest of the year. We have seen politicians and media marking the Quebec Mosque shooting with mourning and with tears, even while they continue to perpetuate the same conditions that allowed hatred of Muslims to be normalized in the first place. And this is what we must reflect upon as we mark the anniversary of the Quebec Mosque shooting. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziza. So I think we will try to make some time for questions after, but before we do that, I wanted to hand the mic over to Premier Kathleen Wynne. This is just one of several times that we've had the privilege of welcoming her here at Noor, and we know that she is often out and about in a lot of Muslim spaces, apparently has more shalwar kameez than I do in her collection. So, 2 feet of them, okay, that's impressive. You'll have to give me your source. So, Premier Kathleen Wynne, please.
Thank you, Khadija. The source of all of my shalwar kameez are my Eid bazaars that I have in my riding. All the women vendors come. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's wonderful to be here at Noor again. Thank you so much. And thank you for your reflections today. I'm very sorry that I'm joining you so late in the day, but I'm glad to have made it, and I'm glad to have heard both of you. And, I think that one of the most important things that you said just at the end there was that we have to call each other out on hypocrisy and make sure that we are walking the talk. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing that. So I'm just going to restate what I know you've been talking about, because I think it bears restating that on January 29th, 2017, an act of terrorism at the Islamic Cultural Centre of Quebec City left 6 Canadian men dead. They were a halal grocery store owner, a university professor, a pharmacy worker, and 3 civil servants, 2 of whom were best friends. They were killed by a gunman in a place where everyone should be safe, a place of worship in Canada. This senseless violence left 6 women without their husbands and 17 children without their fathers. 1 year on, it is still difficult to process, and I would say impossible to accept. So last week, I know that there were a number of memorials for the victims held in Quebec and right across Canada, because this has had an effect on us all. And if it hasn't, it should have. And it calls on us to confront some very uncomfortable questions about our society. We see mass shootings on the news all too often, but not here. This isn't supposed to happen in our country. It's not how we see ourselves. It doesn't fit with our understanding of Canada, with the image that we have of who we are. But it did happen here. It happened here. And the only mosque shooting ever to happen in North America happened here in Canada. And that demands some soul searching. And I know that that is what you have been doing today. How, in a place as richly diverse as this, has Islamophobia been allowed to spread? And how can we put a stop to it? That's the question that we really have to grapple with. In a world where the news cycle moves so fast, what can we do to always remember January 29th, 2017, and the 6 men who were killed, and make meaning of that, learn from that, and do something to prevent that from ever happening again? What I remember most from the days immediately following the shooting is how people of all faiths and backgrounds came forward to make it clear that we as a country and a province do not stand for what happened. That's what we said. We marched against Islamophobia, attended candlelight vigils, put signs on our front lawns declaring that no matter where you come from, you're welcome in this neighborhood. And that's the Canada that I want to be real. That's the Canada that I want to live in. And we need everyone's help in order to build that Canada. I was very moved to hear that you're helping to raise money to buy an accessible home for Ayman Derbali, who was paralyzed that day, trying to distract the shooter. He was shot 7 times, left him in a wheelchair. And he spoke at the vigil in Quebec last Monday, as many of you know, and I just want to echo something that he said. He said, "We are all human beings. We have many similarities. The values that unite us are much more important than the small things that differ." That's what I believe, that in our humanity, we share more than divides us. And I believe that government has an important role to play, not just in declaring those values, but in acting on them. And one of the things that it's important, I think, for politicians to say is that, as uncomfortable as it is, I accept that systemic racism exists. It exists in our communities, it exists in our institutions, it exists in our families, and that's not something that we should shy away from. In fact, if we shy away from it and try to pretend that that's not the case, then we will make the same mistakes that we have made as society over and over and over again, because we will not confront the problem. We will not confront the belief systems. The belief systems that bolster those horrible, hateful organizations that we just saw up on the screen. So later this month, when the spring sitting starts at Queen's Park, I just want to share with you that my colleague and friend, Dr. Shafiq Qadri, will take the first steps to proclaim January 29th, the Day of Remembrance and Action Against Islamophobia in the province of Ontario. That's a good thing. And as much as I don't want those days or those actions to be all that we do, I think it is important to say out loud that that needs to happen and to mark that we have to take that step. So this will reaffirm that we stand shoulder to shoulder with our province's Muslim community. It will help to educate people about the dangers of hate. It'll be just one step, I get that, and we'll need to take more, but as Premier, I am committed to take the steps that we need to take. One of the reasons that we have created the Anti-Racism Directorate in Ontario is that there used to be an anti-racism secretariat in Ontario. It was folded, collapsed, done away with under the Mike Harris years. And I thought when I became the Premier, you know, we've got a new equity policy in our education system and we're doing a lot of work across government and institutions. Maybe we can do that work across government and we don't need to create a center within government. But that's not true. We do need it. We need a place where those issues can be dealt with, where there can be a light shone on what's really happening, where there can be data collected, where there can be the facilitation of data being collected in other parts of our society. So that's why the Anti-Racism Directorate exists, to do that work. And it's not just about one racism. It's about anti-Semitism. It's about Islamophobia. It's about anti-Black racism. It's about anti-Indigenous racism, because racism in some parts of our province looks very different than in other parts. So I am committed to doing what it takes with your help. I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you. We are blessed to live in Ontario. We are blessed to live in Canada. We can't lose track of that. But Ontario can be a more vibrant, more inclusive, safer, and fairer place to live. And that's what we all have to work together to make it. Thank you so much. Merci.
Thank you so much, Premier Nguyen. We are past our schedule end time, but I think everyone who comes to NOR expects that things will go a little bit later. So if anyone has to leave, please don't feel bad. No public shaming this time, but we'll take a few questions. So if you do have something to ask of the panelists, Brother Tariq is still here as well for anyone who has questions specific to the documentary that we watched and on the victims of the Quebec Mosque shooting. If anyone has questions, if you could please line up behind the mic, and I'll give you a fair warning. My signature characteristic is, even though I'm late to everything, I'm quite tough with other people on time, so I will make sure that the questions are short, and please keep them to questions as much as possible. So, please.
I'll be very brief. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Closer to the mic, please.
I'll try to be closer. Thank you very much for a great presentation and a documentary. I had one sort of comment/question, in part because, like Professor Matheson, I also share a Nordic heritage. I grew up in Norway, and I was in Norway on the 22nd of July when we had our own sort of, watershed moment with a major terrorist attack. And there were two sort of enduring impressions that were left with me right after. One was the immediate knee-jerk reaction, this is hallmark Islamic terrorism, and that sort of continued for a couple of hours. The other thing that emerged afterwards, which is really sort of the gendered element of Islamophobia, was that there were a number of incidents where the most visibly Muslim people were attacked, and they were women wearing the hijab. So I'm curious, and you guys are obviously leaders in our community who just happens to be women. Maybe you can shed a bit more light on the gender dynamic, because that wasn't sort of highlighted to such a great extent. Maybe it was conscious, maybe it wasn't. But I'd be very keen to hear that sort of in the Canadian context.
Sorry, Aziza. Well, first of all, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're women, but maybe we'll take a couple questions because we are short on time. So sorry, what was there? You want some perspective on gender?
On the gender dynamics of
on gender dynamics of Islamophobia. And we'll take a few questions. Dorothy isn't able to make it to the mic, but so please. And I'll repeat the question as well, so.
This morning on my Remembrance program, there was a program the trauma to children who lost a parent, the American 9/11, and it was just amazing. And I want to ask Phil because he mentioned something about the treatment of the children, because apparently there are groups and there are programs to help the children adjust, well, never adjust, but the physician who's in charge of it, he said he lost his father when he was 10 years old, and he still feels that way even though he's in his 60s and he's been doing this for 15 years for many, many years. So I just wanted to know what kind of programs are going to be implemented for the children who have lost and or seen the damages of that.
Okay, thanks, Dorothy. So that question was about the trauma of losing a parent and specific services made available or being or moves towards making services to deal with that aftermath. Dr. Hayani?
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm very, very pleased that I had the chance to attend today's event. I think it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I congratulate the North Center for organizing it. I have actually two questions. One
Two small
is,
questions.
No, one actually short one. One to Professor Ingrid Madsen. Like, why it seems most of the literature I read about Islamophobia, the anti-Muslims try to present Islam the way they wanted it to be, not the way Islam is. Like, could you just explain this? Like, it's really strange. Like, they want Muslim to be bad and Islam to be bad, but really Muslims and Islam are not really as bad as they think they are. Okay, so that's the second one. Like, you know, probably the Harper government, was he responsible for lots of things? Like, you know, the 18, supposedly the case of the 18 kids, and then...
The Toronto 18, yeah.
The trauma, exactly. And then, which of course proved to be, it was financed by the government. They paid guys $6 million in order to organize this thing. The second is when actually during the election, which was very stupid, when they decided to organize this called the barbaric culture. Now, is there anything within the Canadian law that one can literally sue the government, and especially the Harper government? Please answer the question.
Okay, so actually, so I know we have a couple more questions, but let's start with these ones first, and let me just repeat them briefly for the benefit of our panelists and the audience. So the first question was on the gendered manifestations of Islamophobia. The second was on trauma related to the Quebec Mosque shooting, specifically with regards to losing a parent and any services that were being made available to the youth, because DAWNet has been working on that. The third question was the way that anti-Muslim bigotry presents Islam as a theology in a way that serves the interests of Islamophobia. And the final one was that how can we sue Harper?
We dealt with him.
Abid?
Yes, now it's on, okay. You know, most people who are people will rationalize their prejudices. They try to present them as good things, that they're doing something that's rational, that's in keeping with good values. I mean, most people don't come out and simply say, I'm a racist or I'm a bigoted person. There's always some rationalization process that happens. And when it comes to Islam, claiming to be protecting Muslim women is an old tactic. I mean, you can go back to Lord Cromer, who, while at home in Victorian England, was the president of the women's suffragette group, meaning that he was actively working to prevent English women from getting the vote. Also was the Viceroy of Egypt and claimed that the English had invaded Egypt and were running it in order to protect women from horrible Muslim men and from being oppressed by Muslim men and by Islam. And of course, he closed down the Women's Medical College while he was there, the indigenous Egyptian Women's Medical College, because, well, as we know, women are too hysterical to be able to handle surgery. So this is a very old technique. I really think this is where we see the overlap between gender-based violence and Islamophobia. The fact that many people claim the right to tell Muslim women how they should act, what they should wear, what kind of families they should have. It's offered under the guise of paternalism, but this is clearly what the statement is, that they know better. That they know better than these women what is good for them. And so bigots are really masters of projection. I have to say that. I mean, you see it again and again and again. So, the idea that, well, it's Muslims who want to impose their religion or their Sharia or their way of life on us, yet the people who are saying that were actively creating legislation to prevent Muslims from living their own choices. So this constant projection is such a problem, but again, when we look at the overlap of Islamophobia and racism, we should be aware of it. I mean, you have something like, the stereotype that black people are so violent, yet it is black people who are subject to the most violence by the state. You have this stereotype, women, they just talk so much, they just can't stop talking, yet it is women who have been silenced again and again and again for centuries. So, Jews will not replace us. The chant at Charlottesville said after Jewish people literally were murdered and they were replaced in their own homes by the murderous Nazis who killed them. They literally took the gold out of their teeth to make jewelry for it. So who was doing the replacing? And so that's also another sign. Just always beware of this kind of projection. As soon as you hear them saying, well, those people are like this, I'm not a psychiatrist, but it's pretty obvious that it's a very common technique.
The double standards and hypocrisy of Islamophobia is extremely evident in the way that it talks about and regulates Muslim women. On the one hand, it claims to be saving Muslim women. On the other hand, we know that the hatred generated by it predominantly leads to violence against Muslim women. When you look at hate crime statistics, Islamophobic hate crimes are the ones with the highest percentage of women victims. And this is not only in the case of hate crimes, it's also in the case of state-sponsored violence, like the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which was mentioned by Dr. Hayani, which was introduced by the Harper Conservatives, but was also supported by the Trudeau Liberals. This is a law that is claiming to save Muslim women from the barbaric cultural practices inflicted upon us by the men of our community, things like forced marriage and polygamy. But we know that people who work on the ground with Muslim women and the targeted communities were saying the whole time while the law was being debated that this law is actually going to hurt the women that it is claiming to save. Criminalizing people who participate in forced marriages would deter women who have been subjected to forced marriages from coming forward to the state in order to seek help if it would mean that their family members would be subjected to criminal sanction. This is what the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario stated very clearly in a report that it produced on forced marriages. The government uses the statistics on forced marriages from the report while completely ignoring the recommendations against criminalization. You can also see the disingenuousness of Islamophobes' concern for Muslim women and the way that they react to Muslim women who see Islam as a source for gender justice and empowerment. We at Noor Cultural Center get so many angry emails from Islamophobes telling us that you're whitewashing Islam by saying that it empowers women and by saying that it's a force for gender justice. You're misinterpreting Islam. You're trying to whitewash it to make it seem less threatening than it actually is. If they actually care about Muslim women, they should be delighted that we see Islam and interpret Islam in a way that empowers us to fight for our dignity and for our rights and for our equality. But it completely debunks the idea that Islam essentialistically is more patriarchal and more misogynistic than what they see as the enlightened Western liberalism. And so for them, gender-just interpretations of Islam are a threat when it is Muslim women who are developing them, because it debunks the idea that we require saving from other people. When it comes to suing Harper, I think it's important to acknowledge that Islamophobic laws and policies have been a transpartisan affair when it comes to the federal government. Several of the worst abuses that we saw happening in Canada in the name of national security, the illegal rendition and torture of Maher Arar, the Canadian complicity in the torture of Almaty al-Malki and Noordin, and actually this isn't even the extent of it. We're still hearing new cases of men who were tortured with Canadian complicity and using Canadian information. Many of these cases occurred under the pre-Harper Liberals, and the government has been forced to pay compensation to some of them, but we know other cases are still ongoing, like that of Abu Sufyan Abdurazik, as well as the new cases that are continuing to come forward. We also know when it comes to counterterrorism laws that there has been support for these laws from both conservatives and liberals. A good example of this is Bill C-59, which is being debated right now, which purports to be a corrective to the overreach of the draconian counterterrorism law passed during the Harper era, known as Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act 2015, which, by the way, was also supported by the Trudeau Liberals. Now they've introduced a new law to purportedly correct its overreach, and it does in some ways, but in other ways it vastly expands the power of the state in the name of national security. For example, it gives the state new cyber warfare powers. It expands the state's ability to conduct digital surveillance on Canadian citizens. I don't have time to get into all the details of the law right now, but the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group has excellent explainer sheets on the law and what you can do to participate in advocacy to make sure that Canadian civil liberties and rights are safeguarded. So I encourage you to check those out. Of course, these laws can always be challenged under the Charter. Bill C-51 was being challenged by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. Theoretically, the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act could be challenged under the Charter for violating equality, for example. But the problem is that once these laws have been passed, they're implemented and they affect people, and it is extremely timely and costly to then have to go and overturn them in court, which is why it's essential that we mobilize against national security overreach as it's happening and not be seduced by the discourse of Islamophobia, which makes us think that we need these laws in order to protect us from these dangerous Muslims, because that really is a very pernicious effect of Islamophobia, is that it makes us normalize and naturalize and even welcome serious intrusions on our rights and liberties, which are then extremely difficult to reverse.